Welcome back, listeners. Today we're diving into a case, and it's one of those that really gets under your skin, the story of Albert Fish.
Oh, Albert Fish. You hear those nicknames, the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wysteria, even the Brooklyn Vampire, and right away, you know this is going to be a rough one.
Yeah, it's not your typical criminal, that's for sure.
Not at all. And the thing is, he was active in the early 1900s. Back then, newspapers, they didn't exactly dwell on the gory details.
Right.
But Fish, his crimes, they were so horrific that they broke through that, became national news.
Yeah, even today, it's hard to stomach some of the things he did.
Yeah.
Sadism, cannibalism, and he was into, like, extreme self-harm. It's a lot to process.
It really is.
So in this deep dive, we're not just going to list out his crimes. We're going to try and get into, like, the why. What factors could lead to someone becoming so depraved?
It's a journey into the darkest parts of human nature, that's for sure.
Definitely.
And I think to start that journey, we have to go back to the beginning. Fish's childhood. He's born in 1870, and right from the start, there's this shadow of mental illness hanging over him. Family history played a huge part in his life.
And his father, think about this. His father was 75 years old when Albert was born.
Wow.
75.
Bad.
So you can only imagine the pressure on his mother. His father dies when he was just a little kid, and then, well, young Albert ended up in an orphanage.
And orphanages back then, they weren't they weren't places of comfort.
Never from it.
We're talking about a time when discipline was harsh, really harsh. Beatings were common, and Fish, he endured a lot of that. But here's where it gets really unsettling. He later said that he actually started to connect pain with pleasure. Like he got some kind of twisted satisfaction from it.
Yeah, imagine that, a child experiencing that, connecting pain with gratification.
It's really a tragic example of how those early childhood experiences, especially the traumatic ones, how they can warp a person's development.
And sadly, for Fish, these tendencies, they didn't go away as he got older. As an adult, he did marry and have kids.
He did?
But when his wife left him, that seemed to be a real turning point. Like it pushed him even further down this path of self-destruction. And that's when we see the self-harm become really extreme.
Yeah, this wasn't just like minor self-injury. He was driving needles deep into his body, especially around his pelvic area.
That's hard to even imagine.
It is. And we're not talking about just a few needles. Later, when he was arrested, they took x-rays. And they found dozens of needles embedded in his groin, his abdomen. It was just awful. I mean, that level of self-harm, it's a huge red flag, right?
Yeah.
It points to some really, really deep psychological disturbance.
Definitely.
A need to inflict pain, And it's tough to wrap your head around why.
Yeah. But his cruelty wasn't just directed at himself. Fish actually developed this, like, twisted religious justification for his actions.
Oh.
He thought he was chosen to make others suffer.
It's really hard to comprehend.
It is. And get this, he would encourage his own children to hurt him.
It's just chilling how warped his worldview had become. He'd actually have them beat him until he bled. Just horrible.
Oh my gosh. So we've got this really disturbing foundation, right?
Yeah.
And as awful as all of this is, Fish's true reign of terror, that was about to begin. And his targets, well, they were the most vulnerable among us, children.
His most infamous victims, their names, they're etched in true crime history. Francis McDonnell, Billy Gaffney, and then, of course, Grace Budd. Every case was horrific, but it was Grace Budd's case that really led to his capture.
Right. So picture this.
Yeah.
It's 1928. The Budd family, they're struggling to make ends meet in New York City. They put an ad in the paper hoping to find work for their teenage son.
Oh.
And guess who answers that ad?
Oh, no.
Albert Fish.
Disguised.
He called himself Frank Howard, pretended to be this harmless, wealthy farmer.
This is textbook, right? Classic grooming behavior, especially when you're talking about someone who preys on kids. I mean, the level of manipulation it takes to gain a family's trust like that.
It's incredible. And then he lures Grace away with this made-up story about a family party.
Awful.
A promise he never intended to keep. The whole thing was just calculated and cruel.
And for the Budd family, can you imagine? The years that followed, not knowing what happened to Grace, just awful.
I can't even imagine. And then, in 1934, a letter arrives at their doorstep. But this wasn't any ordinary letter. This was a confession. Fish, in his own words, described abducting Grace, murdering her, and he cannibalized her.
It's hard to even fathom, and it raises this question. Why write the letter at all? Was it like a confession? Was he boasting? Or was it just another way to torment this poor family? It's really chilling.
Yeah. But as horrible as the content was, that letter, it actually contained some small details that would be Fish's undoing. Things like the type of paper, the envelope.
Mhm.
Detectives were able to trace it back to his boarding house.
Wow.
And when they confronted him, Fish, he didn't fight back. He didn't deny anything. He just confessed. And the way he did it, it was so calm, so matter of fact, even the investigators, they were shocked.
And he didn't stop with Grace's murder, did he?
No, he didn't. He talked about years of violence, hinted at other victims. It's possible we'll never know the true extent of his crimes.
It's terrifying to think about. And then he went into detail about his fantasies, cannibalism, torture, this like insatiable desire to inflict pain.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to process.
It is. And, you know, the horror wasn't just in the physical acts. He also engaged in this campaign of like psychological terror, sending obscene, threatening letters to families all over the country.
Really?
Yeah. And that's where his appearance, that harmless old man facade, it becomes even more sinister.
Right.
He was the perfect example of what some people call the banality of evil. You know, this seemingly ordinary person capable of unimaginable cruelty. That contrast, it makes it all the more frightening.
Absolutely. It really makes you think. Monsters, they don't always have fangs and claws. They can blend right in.
Exactly. And that's one of the scariest parts of this whole case, I think. It's a stark reminder that evil can hide in plain sight.
It is. It really is. Man, unpacking this case, it's heavy stuff, you know?
It really is. And I think what makes it even harder is we're not just dealing with the physical brutality. It's that psychological torment that Fish inflicted as well, like those letters we talked about.
Right, and how his trial, you know, it just gripped the whole nation, really exposed this horrifying truth about a guy who seemed so ordinary.
And those confessions, too, the way he just calmly described these awful acts, almost like he was, I don't know, almost like he enjoyed reliving it.
Yeah, it's like he got some kind of sick satisfaction out of spreading that fear, you know, like it wasn't enough to just hurt his victims.
Exactly. And those letters he sent to families filled with those awful threats and stories, it was all part of that. Like
Yeah.
he wanted to keep the terror going, keep people living in fear.
It's like he wanted to cast this huge shadow of fear over as many lives as possible, and he got away with it for so long. Just blended right in. The harmless old man.
It really messes with your head, doesn't it? You know, like what are we supposed to look for?
Right. It makes you question everything.
And that's the thing. He completely throws out the window those ideas we have about what a monster looks like.
Right. Like, they don't always have the fangs and the claws. They can look like anyone.
Exactly. And that's, I think, one of the most disturbing points of this whole thing. Evil hiding in plain sight.
It is. It's scary.
Yeah. It really makes you think about mental health, too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Like, was there anything that could have been done, you know, to help Fish, to change his path?
It's hard to say. I mean, we know so much more now about mental illness, about the impact of trauma. Maybe if you'd gotten the right support, things could have been different. But we'll never know.
We'll never know. But it definitely makes you realize how important it is to prioritize mental health, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
I think that's a really important point. We've got to get rid of the stigma around mental illness, you know? Seeking help, that should be seen as a strength, not a weakness.
Imagine if we lived in a world where mental well-being was just as important as physical health, where people had the support they need, you know, to catch them before they fall.
It's a good vision, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I think Fish's case, as awful as it is, it shows us what can happen when we don't make mental health a priority.
Right. And even though the defense tried to argue that he was insane, the court, they held him accountable.
They did. And ultimately, he was sentenced to death, executed in 1936.
That's right.
But even in his final moments, he didn't really show remorse, you know? He still clung to those warped beliefs, tried to justify his crimes as some kind of mission from God.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. But it's a reminder that, I guess, no matter how distorted someone's beliefs are, they can really shape their whole reality, their whole world.
Yeah. Beliefs are powerful. So I'm curious, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what stands out to you the most? What are you taking away from all of this?
I think for me, it's just that chilling realization that, you know, monsters can hide in plain sight. They don't always fit the stereotype.
I agree. It's a sobering thought. And for me, it's also just a reminder of how vital it is to understand mental illness, the signs, the potential consequences, you know?
We might not ever be able to understand, like, the depths of human darkness, you know?
Yeah.
But we can work towards stopping these tragedies,
Mm.
preventing them, protecting the vulnerable.
I think that's the most important thing we can do.
We've really been through it with this case, exploring the dark world of Albert Fish.
Mm.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to shift gears a bit, to move from the horror to, well, to what we can learn from all of this.
Yeah, I agree. As disturbing as Fish's story is, it does give us some valuable insight into, the human mind, how complex it is. And it highlights just how important it is to understand these things and to try to prevent them from happening again.
I mean, it's crucial to remember that Fish, he wasn't born a monster. His life, it was full of trauma, starting way back in his childhood.
Absolutely. We talked about his childhood, right? All that abuse and neglect in that horrible orphanage. And then later on, his family falling apart. Those things, plus what we know now about his mental state, it all played a huge role in how he ended up.
Makes you wonder, right? If he'd gotten the help he needed, the mental health care and support, could things have been different?
It's a tough question. We'll never know for sure. But we can't just write him off as a monster. Understanding what led him to do these things, that's how we learn to recognize the warning signs. And maybe, just maybe, we can intervene earlier when we see them in others.
Yeah, it all comes back to mental health, doesn't it? Making it a priority, not just for individuals, but for everyone.
I think that's so crucial. We need to create a world where mental health is treated just like physical health, where getting help is seen as a good thing, not something to be ashamed of.
Imagine, right? A world where everyone has the support they need, where we can catch people before they fall through the cracks. That's the kind of world we should be striving for.
It is. And Fish's case, as tragic as it is, it really underscores just how important that is.
So as we close out this deep dive, what's your biggest takeaway? What are you walking away with?
Well, for me, it's that renewed sense of urgency around mental health. We can't ignore this stuff. We need to do better, be better at recognizing the signs and offering help, create a world where it's okay to not be okay.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
It also makes me think about how subtle evil can be, how it can hide in plain sight. Like we said, monsters don't always look like monsters.
That's true. But that knowledge, it can also be empowering, right?
You can.
It makes us more aware, more compassionate, more proactive when it comes to protecting those who need it most.
We might not be able to erase darkness completely, but we can definitely work to make it harder for it to take root.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this difficult journey. I hope that by really digging into this case, the darkness of it all, we've shed some light on the human mind and maybe help people understand the importance of mental well-being.
Absolutely. And remember, even when faced with the worst of humanity, there's always hope for a brighter, more understanding future.
Well said. Until next time, folks.